Welcome to the Therapy and Prayer Podcast. Here you'll find the intersection between faith and mental health. I'm your host, Camille. I'm a licensed therapist and clinical social worker, but more importantly, I'm a Christian who really loves the Lord. And I'm just trying to navigate this life without falling victim to it, just like everyone else. Here we take a faith-based approach to all things mental health and wellness, because the Bible tells us to guard our heart and mind, and sometimes we need a little bit of help with that. Hey everyone, welcome back to Therapy and Prayer. I'm your host Camille, and as always, I am so happy to be here. I'm so grateful that you're here. I hope that you're doing well. As always, I hope that you take this moment to just check in with yourself. How are you doing? How are you feeling? What do you need? Okay, so let me first say, I'm so grateful for all of the feedback that I've gotten since I've started doing this podcast. You know, when you're doing something new and when you're doing something for God, you never really know how it's going to be received. And I'm just so grateful for all of you who have been watching and listening and subscribing and leaving just really encouraging comments. It's really a blessing to connect with other people and for my story to be a blessing to others. So thank you so much for being here. All right, let's get into it. Speaking of all the support that I've gotten, there was a comment that someone left on YouTube that was asking about depression and self-hate. And I was trying to find a way to kind of talk about some of these things anyway. And so today we're going to be talking about really depression and self-worth. Because while there are a lot of root causes of depression, when I think about self-hate and how we feel about ourselves, a lot of times what it comes down to is the feeling of worthlessness and what we feel that we deserve and what we feel that we are worthy of. So we're going to talk about that. And then we're going to talk about how our identity in Christ can really help us work through some of those feelings that we have about and towards ourselves. The thing with depression is that, unless it's chemical, it's usually triggered by something. And, honestly, depending on the trigger, it can cause a chemical imbalance. So even if it's chemical and if it's biological, it still can be traced back to something. I'm really big on awareness and trying to get to the root cause of things, increasing our awareness about the things that are affecting us, the things that we're responding and reacting to, how it's showing up in our bodies, and how it's affecting the way that we're able to move in and navigate in the world around us. So today, we're going to be focusing on the connection between depression and self-worth, because I think that it's a big one, really. And like I said a second ago, there are a lot of different causes for depression. You could talk about depression in so many different ways, but today that's the angle that we're going to be taking with it. So I talk a whole lot about our relationship with ourselves. It's like one of the pillars of my clinical work. And through my work with clients, as well as my own journey with a lot of this, I've learned that there are many things that threaten our relationship with ourselves. There are a lot of things that can affect the way that we see ourselves, the way that we feel about ourselves, the way that we perceive ourselves. It doesn't just come out of nowhere. I had a professor who said behavior doesn't happen in a vacuum. It's not isolated. These things just don't come out of nowhere. And I think that's really important for us to acknowledge, because we have a tendency to blame ourselves so much. And especially for the conversation that we're having today, there's a lot of self-blaming and shaming that happens. So we first have to acknowledge that these things just did not come out of nowhere. Wake up one day and you hate yourself. That's not it. So we're going to look at just a few of those contributing factors today, because we do not have time to get into all of them. And depending on your story, there could be a lot of different things that kind of threaten that relationship with yourself, so much so that it gets to the point where we become like disgusted with ourselves and sometimes even hate ourselves. That's a really strong word. And through my work, I've learned that it's not always that we hate ourselves and just can't stand ourselves and don't want to be around ourselves, but it's that we don't feel worthy. We feel so much shame that we feel disqualified from any good thing. And I think those are a lot of the things that's kind of at the root of this self-hatred that we talk about sometimes. But when you're walking around with thoughts and feelings of worthlessness, hopelessness, disgust, shame, guilt, depression is almost inevitable. It is right around the corner. It's a hop, skip, and a jump away, because these are a lot of the symptoms of depression anyway. In the DSM, when we are diagnosing for depression, Those are some of the pillars that we look for. Feelings of worthlessness, feeling empty, lots of isolation, hopelessness, no motivation. So when you're walking around with all of that inside of you because of how you feel about yourself, you're probably already depressed. If you didn't know, you're probably already depressed. But before we even really get into the bulk of our conversation today, I want to give an encouragement to someone who might be in this position. If you are someone who feels a lot of this hopelessness and disgust and worthlessness when you think about yourself, if these are, things that kind of come up for you, or if you feel like maybe you hate yourself, the fact that you don't want to feel that way about yourself anymore says that you have the capacity to feel differently. It's really important that I stress that, because a lot of times when we are dealing with things like depression, we feel so powerless and we feel so helpless. We feel like these things are just so big and bigger than us, and that there's nothing that we can do about it. We doubt our ability to heal or to grow. And we talked about some of this before, but I really want to make this point that you don't have to grow to a certain point first before you are capable of healing from these certain things. The fact that you feel this inner conflict, the fact that I have these really negative, horrible feelings about myself, and it doesn't feel good, and I don't want to have these negative, horrible feelings about myself. That is enough. And if that's how you feel, if that's where you find yourself, then you're on the right track and there is hope for you still. The most difficult part about working with depression and overcoming it is the hopelessness. I can't really give somebody else hope, but we can find it. It doesn't take much. We talk about our faith being as small as a mustard seed, and I think it's really similar when it comes to hope. You don't need very much, just a little crack in the door, and then you can kick it wide open. So if you feel like maybe I do hate myself, or I have these strong negative feelings about myself, but I don't want to have them anymore, perfect, great, you're in the right place. And that's enough for you to start, and that's enough for you to start facilitating your healing. If you have that inner conflict, then there's hope, even if you can't see it or if you don't really feel it yet. And prayerfully, by the end of this episode, that hope won't feel so elusive to you. Okay, let's jump into it. If we're going to talk about how you feel about yourself and your relationship with yourself, we kind of have to go back to the beginning and look at where we first learned, or where we first got those messages about who we are, what we deserve, and how worthy we are. We all had different upbringings, and some people were blessed with a village that really poured into them and nurtured them from a young age, made them feel really good about themselves and very, very confident, who spoke truth into them. Now, if this was the case for you, then it likely helped you develop a pretty strong and secure self-image and idea of who you are and about what you deserve and how worthy you are, which is such a blessing if that's what you had growing up. Now, if this type of nurturing wasn't readily available to you, then it's probably been a bit more difficult for you to feel that sense of worthiness, or to feel strong and secure in your identity and who you are as a person. And you've probably likely also had to rely on external circumstances, or come up with your own conclusions about who you are. And you've probably had to rely on your external circumstances, external validation, or just kind of come up with your own conclusions about who you are based on what you saw around you. Now, let me say this, and you might think that it's not necessary to say, but you'd be really surprised. Regardless of the environment that you grew up in, you didn't have a say in that. You did not have a say in the way that you grew up, in who was in your family structure, who was in your household, where you lived, who was around you, what influences were around you. You didn't have a say in that. It's important that we get that we understand that we accept that. We're going to talk about it some more later, but one of the reasons that we have this kind of self-hatred is because we blame ourselves for things that simply were not our fault. And this is one of those things. You did not get to decide which family you were born into. You didn't get to decide how you were raised. Okay. So regardless of which category you fall into, you're not responsible for that. We need to hear these things out loud sometimes. We need to hear them so that we can kind of free ourselves from the guilt and shame, the unnecessary guilt and shame that we carry. Okay, so If you fall into the second category, if you were raised in an environment that was not as nurturing and not as affirming, then these are probably some things that you've had to deal with. These are maybe some things that have affected the way that you view yourself. Number one, past trauma. We're going to come back to that one, but past trauma. Not meeting expectations of other people, not meeting expectations of yourself, maybe having unreasonably high expectations of yourself. Codependency, low self-esteem, no individuality or sense of personal identity, no real knowledge of self or no connection with yourself and who you are, having to rely on external validation, and then just so much comparison. Now, we don't have time to cover all of these today. We're only going to talk about a few of them. But there are so many things that affect the way that we understand not only the world around us, but the way that we understand who we are and our personal identity. This may not sound relevant, but I promise it is. When we talk about the connection between depression and how we feel about ourselves, we have to understand why we feel the way that we feel about ourselves. So the three from that list that we're going to focus on are the three that I probably see the most, or the three kind of recurring themes that come up in my clients that I work with. Number one is going to be past trauma. Number two, codependency. And number three, comparison. Those are the big three. Like I said, though, there are a lot of different things that we could talk about that affect the way that we feel about ourselves. We might have to revisit this topic at another time, but today we're going to focus primarily on those three. So when we have experienced trauma, especially in childhood, it is almost always at the hands of someone else. No, let me rephrase. In childhood, it is always at the hands of someone else, whether that be someone else's decisions, someone else's neglect, someone else's negligence, someone else's projection of something. When you experience childhood trauma, it is not your fault. We have to hear that as well. It's really heartbreaking when I see someone or I'm speaking with someone and they're telling a part of their story, but they're telling it from a lens that places the blame on them. Even though the trauma wasn't our fault, there's really this tendency to blame ourselves for the things that we suffer through. And I think sometimes that is in an effort to try to make sense of what happened. When we talk about grief, one of the stages of grief is bargaining. And in bargaining, that's when we try to make sense of things that happen. And when we don't have any information or answers from other people, when we only have ourselves to rely on, then we center ourselves in whatever pain it is that we're trying to work through, because that's the only plausible conclusion that we can come up with. So when we think back to our trauma, we'll say things like, well, maybe if I had just done better in school, or maybe if I had just been more quiet, or maybe if I hadn't had done that thing, or it's because I was always acting out, or it's because I wasn't helping my siblings enough, or because there were too many mouths to feed, or whatever it might be. We blame ourselves for this trauma that was absolutely not our fault. And when your unhealed trauma is such a big part of your past, it gets harder and harder to separate the things that you went through from who you are. Your trauma becomes a part of your identity. Last week, when we were talking about self-sabotage and spiritual strongholds, and I was talking about how we have a tendency of over-identifying with things that we're trying to be delivered from. And it's kind of a similar thought. We over-identify with our experiences because they have shaped so much of our experience. So it's significant to say that it is a part of your story, and maybe to a certain extent a part of who you are. But when that becomes your identity, or when the effects of that trauma become your identity, then that's going to contribute to this negative feeling, this negative view and perception that we have of ourselves. Trauma just has a way of shifting our worldview. When I used to work with kids and we would assess for trauma, the way that I would ask them, because they don't always understand the language of have you had a traumatic experience, the way that I would put it to them is, has anything really hard, really difficult, or really bad happened in your life that kind of changed things for you, that changed the way that you see things, or changed the way that things were for you? It shifts everything in us. It has the capacity to shift everything in us. And when we carry so much shame from our past, it makes us believe that we're not qualified for good things in the future. A couple weeks ago, we talked about guilt and shame, and we see that so much in trauma. If your trauma had to do with abuse or neglect or manipulation from another person, then a lot of times what we'll see is this thought that maybe you deserved it, or that it was your fault, or that it has left you with like this kind of crimson stain, right? Like a scarlet letter, and you are now untouchable, like in a bad way, right? Like, because I went through this thing, I am no longer qualified for love, or I can't have a healthy relationship because I came from an abusive one, or I'm like not qualified to have a healthy relationship because I haven't seen one. I think a lot of people can identify with that. But again, neither of those are true. None of that is true. It was not your fault. You are not disqualified from love. You are not disqualified from healthy relationships, or from success, or from having good things, or from living a healthy life. What you went through was not your fault. I'll say it as many times as I need to, because I have a feeling that maybe you haven't heard that before if this applies to you. It was not your fault. You didn't do anything to deserve it. I hope that you hear that. If this is for you, I hope that you hear that. And until we're able to accept that truth and start healing, you will continue to feel worthless. And you'll keep having this negative view of yourself. So we're walking around with this worthlessness. We're walking around with this negative view of ourselves. And so we're kind of walking around with this like dark cloud when we have not healed from the pain of our past. The other reason for this self-hate that we see a lot has to do with codependency. Now, we are not going to get all the way into codependency. That's probably for another episode when we talk about attachment and relationships and all of that. But so many of us are codependent and don't even know it. Like we're not even really familiar. That's one of those buzzwords that we hear flying around a whole lot. And I think that we have a kind of a limited understanding of what it actually is and how it can really show up for you. But one of the easiest ways to explain codependency is taking on responsibility for another person's mental and emotional well-being. In other words, you're not okay if they're not okay. And if you grew up in a household with codependency, then a lot of times maybe even your physical safety was at risk if someone in the household was not okay mentally or emotionally. And so if it was your role to manage someone else's emotions for your own safety, which meant that you became dependent on their emotional well-being to have your needs met. That's where that codependency comes from. Then your whole role in this person's life is in managing and regulating their emotions. So now they're dependent on you to regulate them, and you're dependent on them to regulate you. So that can make you acutely attached to how other people feel, what they're doing, what they're saying, what they're thinking. And in adulthood, we carry this in relationships as well. So later in life, if someone that you care about, if they have like a minimal shift, then you are immediately going to assume responsibility for that shift. And if you can't make it better, then what does that say about you? And then there was probably some way that you caused the shift. Maybe when they said to pass the pepper, you didn't pass it quick enough. And so they got irritated, and that's why they didn't answer your call the next day. It really be that small sometimes. Like it really, I know that sounds like a crazy example, but that's really how it shows up sometimes. And so now you're fixated on the fact that this person is mad at you, or that you're not a good sister, cousin, friend, partner, spouse, whatever it is. And now that is speaking to your identity in the context of this relationship. You become so tethered to other people's emotional well-being to your own detriment. So when someone else is not okay, that automatically says something negative about you and about who you are. And that's going to validate whatever negative feelings you already have about yourself. Let me say this. When you have a negative belief about yourself, we are subconsciously looking for evidence to support that negative belief about ourselves. So if I already believe that I'm too much for someone, then any small and if I have this codependency, right, then any small shift in someone else, I'm going to find a way to make that validate the fact that I'm too much. Or that's always going to be the default answer or response I'm going to go to in my head. I didn't pass the pepper shaker quick enough. I'm too slow, or I'm too this, or I'm too that, or like they're just so fed up with me. Like, you're looking for evidence to support this negative belief that you have about yourself when they are so locked into our core, when they are part of our fundamental belief about who we are and what we deserve. We're always going to be looking for evidence to support that. So we really want to get to a point where we can unlearn these beliefs and create new ones. When you recognize that you authored this belief, or that you had a hand in authoring this belief, let me say that, because like we just said, some of the things that you have gone through were absolutely not your fault. But when you recognize that you had a hand in authoring this belief, or maybe it was that you had a hand in sustaining this belief, then you can be empowered enough to release it and write a new one. Even from the things that have happened from you in the past, when you were a child and the adults in your life didn't keep you safe, they don't have to keep you safe anymore. They're not here to bring any danger, hopefully. So prayerfully, if you're in a situation or circumstance now where that hurtful or abusive person is no longer in your space, then you are now the one who's in a position to be able to create a safer environment for yourself. And that starts with what it is that you choose to believe about yourself and who you are and what you deserve. The other issue with codependency is that you probably ain't got no boundaries. If you have dealt with codependency, then I know you ain't got no boundaries, because that's a part of it. You never learned to assert yourself or to prioritize your own needs. Your needs were not as important as someone else's needs, because if their needs weren't met, then yours couldn't be met. Which means that in relationships now, you probably don't have any boundaries, and there's maybe lots of enmeshment and lots of relationships that maybe are maybe kind of intrusive, or maybe you have a tendency of overextending yourself. And so we go to all of these lengths and we still have these negative beliefs about ourselves. So you probably have really poor boundaries, and you maybe think that you don't have the right to speak up for yourself or to advocate for yourself, because you've never been given permission to do that, or because no one has ever done it for you. And so if no one has ever done it for you, or if you've never been given permission to advocate for yourself, then you may believe that it's because you don't deserve advocacy, or that you don't deserve an advocate. But we have an advocate, amen, who is greater. All right, let me not get ahead of myself. But in your experience, it may have been dangerous for you to speak up for yourself or to advocate for yourself in that way. And so it becomes safer just to kind of stay in your shell and to silence yourself. Were you silent, or were you silenced? And if you were silenced, by whom? Was it by others? Was it by yourself? Remember, we're talking about your relationship with yourself here. So some of the habits that we have developed have to do with the way that we treat ourselves, the way that we advocate for ourselves, the way that we meet our own needs, the way that we acknowledge or prioritize our own needs, if we do those things at all. But overall, when you associate your sense of self-worth with someone else's feelings, it becomes so fragile and so fickle because there's no solid foundation. It is not a solid foundation to completely tether your feelings of self-worth and your identity to the way that someone else feels about you. When we talk about looking for external validation and really needing that external validation, that's also a fickle place to be, because other people are not as predictable. We don't know how someone's going to feel that day. They have an infinite number of variables affecting them and affecting how they feel. But also, we have to get to a place where we can validate ourselves. We can find that internal validation. When we rely so heavily on the external validation, then that's another reason why our identity can be really, really fragile, because it's shifting depending on who it is that we're talking to and what kind of validation we're seeking from them in that moment. And that's going to kind of lead us into the last piece of this, which has to do with comparison. That's like the last contributing factor we're going to talk about today is comparison. Now, I've talked about comparison before, but when it comes to the way that it affects your self-worth, your sense of identity, the way that you view yourself, the way that you think about yourself, it is so detrimental. Now, what we've talked about before is the fact that comparison, we compare from a lens of deficit. We compare ourselves to people based on what we know we're lacking and what we know they have. When that's the way that we approach it, When that's the way that we're viewing ourselves, we're always going to come up short. You are always going to come up short. You will never be as good, quote unquote, as good as the person you're comparing yourself to. And if you have a habit of comparison, whether it be via social media or in real life, if you have a habit of comparison, and if you're always comparing from a place of lack, that means that you are always falling up short, which means that you have a habit of highlighting your shortcomings. That's kind of heavy. You have a habit of highlighting your shortcomings. That's the primary way that you interact with other people, or that's the primary way that you interact with yourself. And that's got to be pretty damaging because it paints a one-sided picture of who you are. When we have this habit of comparison, we don't give ourselves enough credit. And that's one of the saddest things that I see sometimes. We do not give ourselves credit for like really anything. Not even just like for the big stuff or for the little stuff, but really anything. You can set a goal for yourself, meet that goal, and then critique yourself and be critical for the way that you got to that goal, or be critical for not getting there sooner, or be critical for not getting there as quickly as somebody else did. When this is the way that you view yourself, you will always find a way. You will always find a way that you're lacking if this is the primary way that you view and interact with yourself, which will leave you always feeling depressed. Beyond just making us feel bad, this habit of comparison, it can make us feel like confused and uncertain about who we are, who we want to be, who we think we should be. It just creates this really frustrating and confusing pot of identity. I don't know if pot is the right word, but it really kind of confuses it. And it makes it even harder to know which parts of you are true and authentic, or which parts of you you've convinced yourself exist in lieu of something else that you don't have. Is this making sense? Y'all, I be confusing myself sometimes, so I'm sorry if I'm confusing you too. All in all, these three things, right? Trauma, codependency, and comparison, what they have in common is the effect that it has on our personal identity. Now, I know that question, who are you? It's like a big existential question and it's really difficult to answer. And I don't think that many people have a very clear and concise answer of who they are. I don't have a 2 or 3 sentence blurb about who I am, I don't think. But at the same time, I feel like I've got a pretty good understanding of who I am at my core as a person. So I'm not saying that you have to be able to answer that question at the drop of a dime, but internally, intrinsically, intuitively, do you feel connected with the core of who you are? Do you know the things that are important to you? Are there a few things that you could identify that help to lay the foundation of who you are? For me, I would say it's my faith. It is family. It is compassion. It's joy. It's peace. Like, I think those are maybe some of the core things, some of the bricks of the foundation of who I am. There are probably some other things if I had to sit and think a little bit longer about it, but are you able to identify some of the core foundational principles of who you are? And when we navigate the world from the lens of all of these 3 things that we just talked about, it's really difficult to know what those foundational things are, or those foundational things will be a direct result of that trauma, that codependency, and that comparison. So if I say, what are some of the things that are at the core of who you are, you may not be able to answer specifically, but you might start to say like things that you are not. Like, there have been times where I'm talking about this with people and they'll just start to go through a laundry list of things that they don't like about themselves as they're trying to think of the things that make them who they are. If the first thing that comes to mind when someone asks about who you are, when you think about who you are, if the first thing that comes to mind are the things that you don't like about yourself, then we need to make a shift. That should not be the first thing that comes to mind when you think about what are the principles of the foundation of my identity. And we've got some work to do. Whether it's trauma, codependency, or comparison, all of those leave us with fragments of who we are or who we might be at our core. And all of those leave us believing the lies of the enemy. Because one thing that devil gonna do is lie. He gonna lie to you about who you are and about what you deserve. And so when we view ourselves through that lens, that's what we're left with. Not only can this lead to more depression and isolation, but in a spiritual sense, this develops into a manifestation of the enemy's primary tactic, which is deception. Think about the thoughts and beliefs that you carry based on how you feel about yourself. Maybe some of these thoughts or beliefs are, I can never do anything right. No one will ever love me. I'm a failure. I'm a disgrace. I'm not good enough. I'm too much. I can't come back from the things that I've done. None of that sounds like God. And the word tells us who we are. Right? There are so many verses that speak to our identity, the way that God views us and the way that he made us. And none of that aligns with those thought patterns that we just listed. And so if those are the things that we're believing about ourselves, then there's no room to believe what God has to say about us. All right, so those negative thought processes those are the ones that the enemy tells us, right? Those are the ones that he wants us to believe about who we are. But here are just some of the things. Here are some of the things that the Bible says about who we are. We are made in his image. We are more than conquerors. We are the bride of Christ. We are a royal priesthood. We are forgiven. We are children of God. We are free. We are loved. We are precious. We are heirs to the kingdom. We are treasured. We are complete. We are a new creature. We are protected. We are strong. And that's not even all of them. That is what God says about who you are. So it's up to you who you want to believe. You saying God is wrong? Is God wrong for saying you're precious and treasured and a royal priesthood and an heir to the kingdom and complete? Is he wrong? That's on you to answer. But that's what it has to come down to. And I know that it's easier said than done. This is one of those things that we want to wake up tomorrow and just like not hate ourselves anymore. We want to wake up tomorrow and just have this inner relationship with ourselves be healed, but it doesn't work that way. And this is one of those areas that you really have to speak truth to the lies of the enemy, because he will continue to lie to you. And when those lies feel so true, it is easier, almost, not even almost, for sure, it's easier to believe them than to speak truth to them, right? What is that verse? One of my memory verses now is one of my new memory verses, but it talks about how we take every thought captive to the obedience of Christ. These are those thoughts that we're talking about, the thoughts that do not align with what God says about who you are. And not only are we perfectly and wonderfully made in his image, but God gave each person specific characteristics and gifts and personality traits on purpose. I really had to let this settle in my heart that God made me, Camille, the way that I am on purpose. He needed me to be this person with this personality. You know, for a long time, there have been parts of my personality that have been difficult for me to accept and fully embrace. One of those is that I have, I think, a strong personality. I've been labeled as aggressive a lot in my upbringing, and that always really bothered me. And still, I don't think that that's very accurate with like who I am, like mean, aggressive. I also think that I have fallen into the angry black woman trope because I'm a strong black woman, and we ain't got time to get into all that, but it really bothered me to the point that I was like, you know what? I need to be a lot softer. I need to embrace my femininity more because I didn't want to be perceived as aggressive or as mean. But the perception of other people does not deter what God says about me and about who I am. And what I had to learn and embrace and appreciate is that God made me strong because he needed me to be strong. God made me not afraid to speak up because he needs people who are not afraid to speak up and to be a voice for him. Now, if I really shied away from that, and honestly, I couldn't if I wanted to, because I did try. I tried not to be that person. I tried not to be that girl. I couldn't because it's who I am. But it's who I am because it is who God made me on purpose. So who am I to reject something that God put inside of me because he deemed it necessary and good to put it inside of me? if we believe that God is good and that everything that he does is good, that don't stop with you. That says that everything that God has put in you is good. So the things that maybe we reject are good. The things that we have gone through, he's working it out for our good, right? Maybe it has developed into something in you that is good or that can be good or can be used for good, for your good, for his good. There is good. And we have to be able to see the good in ourselves. And it's really hard sometimes when we spend a lot of times hating and loathing and rejecting ourselves. And when we are rejecting ourselves so much, we are rejecting part of God's creation. I don't know about you, but I'm not trying to do that. Who am I to reject something that God created? God in his perfect and holiness and in his righteousness. God in all of his majesty created this being me, the way that I am, with my personality, with my gifts, with my character, with my body, created me this way. Who am I to reject it? Don't that sound kind of crazy? Not only that, but God never stops pursuing us no matter what we've done in our past. Let that free you right now, regardless of what you have gone through in your past, regardless of what maybe you have done or experienced or seen or not done. God never stops pursuing you. If God never stops loving you, then why should you stop loving you? Not only why should you, but if God never stops loving you, what gives you the right to stop loving you? Now, I know we don't always feel like sunshine and roses and flowers with ourselves, and we're not always on like the solo date tip, and we're not always our own favorite person. That's okay. We don't want to paint an unrealistic picture of what that looks like. And so it's not always, I guess, the stereotypical view of self-love that it is that we're after, because that may not be authentic to you either. But when you love someone, how do you treat them? When you love someone, how do you think of them? When you love someone, what are you willing to do if they needed it? When you love someone, right? You don't always have to be up in their face all the time. You don't always have to get along with them. But if you love them, you don't want to hurt them. You want to make sure that they're okay. If you can, you want to help meet their needs. So in those terms, think about what it might look like to love yourself or to show yourself love. Maybe if we say it that way, it's a little bit easier to grasp, because to go from like, I hate myself to I love myself, that's a big jump. That's not always very realistic. Can you still show love to someone that maybe you don't like? Because we're commanded to do that anyway. We're commanded. Oh, here we go. We're commanded to love our enemies. If you are your enemy, you still have to love yourself. You still have to show yourself some love. Even if you are your number one hater, you still have to show yourself some love, because that's what the Bible says we have to do. So think about it that way. All right. That's going to lead us into our scripture of the day. I actually have two passages for us today. They kind of go together. So stay with me here. Let me cook for a second. Okay. The first one is Psalms 139:13-16. It says, "You made all the delicate inner parts of my body and knit me together in my mother's womb. Thank you for making me so wonderfully complex. Your workmanship is marvelous. How well I know it. You watched me as I was being formed in utter seclusion, as I was woven together in the dark of the womb. You saw me before I was born. Every day of my life was recorded in your book. Every moment was laid out before a single day had passed." Think about the care and concern that God put into creating you. That's what this is talking about. God made you exactly who you are, specifically and on purpose. Okay? Now, when sin enters the chat and makes us feel shameful and worthless, it's really easy to forget how intentional God was. Now, when sin enters the chat and makes us feel shameful and worthless, it's really easy, I think, to forget how intentional God was when he created us. And this verse is a reminder of the intentionality that went into creating you. And even when we sin, God offers redemption because he never stops loving us. That's the thing, is that in our human mind, we feel like we have run out of rope and that the love has run out. We have conditional love towards ourselves. I never thought about that, but we have conditional love towards ourselves. We've talked about conditional love towards other people before, but sometimes the love that we have for ourselves is conditional, or maybe we haven't been taught or shown or given an example of what it looks like to love yourself and to really take care of yourself. And sometimes that's how it looks. Sometimes it just looks like taking care of yourself and making sure that your needs are met. Sometimes that's all it is. Sometimes that's how we start, by showing love for yourself. Okay, yeah. So God never stops loving us, and He offers redemption and forgiveness because He loves us. Okay. So again, if God can forgive you, then you need to be able to forgive yourself. The next passage is from Romans 8:38 through 39. It says, and I am convinced that nothing can ever separate us from God's love, neither death nor life, neither angels nor demons, neither our fears for today nor our worries about tomorrow. Not even the powers of hell can separate us from God's love. No power in the sky above or in the earth below. Indeed, nothing in all creation will ever be able to separate us from the love of God that is revealed in Christ Jesus our Lord. I think what I want to say is, if you cannot find love for yourself, can you find the love that God has for you? And let that sustain you. I know that it can be hard to feel that way about yourself, especially if you are really in the pits of depression. I don't take it lightly. I don't want to talk about it very lightly either. But when we are in this depressive mode and in these depressive episodes, and when we are just walking around with this darkness all around us and all over us, it's real easy to say, love yourself because God loved you. Sure. But that love is not always easy to access. And so this verse is saying that even that darkness, that cloud of darkness that might be following you, is not enough to separate you from the love of God. Can you access somewhere in your mind, in your heart, the love that God has for you, and let that sustain you? Let that sustain you, and let that maybe show you how to love yourself. God never stopped loving us when we were going through our traumatic experiences. God never stopped loving us when we were being codependent with other people. God never stopped loving us when we were too busy comparing ourselves to other people. Our negative beliefs and all these things that we believe about ourselves and think about ourselves, they do not disqualify us from the love of God. Nothing does. You know, that verse that says, my thoughts are above your thoughts, my ways are above your ways. God's love is above our love. So that's an even greater love. So if you can't access that love within yourself for yourself, that's okay, because you have access to an even greater love. And that's the love of God. Look for examples in the Word of when He is showing love and other people showing love to one another. If you can start there, if you can access that love, if you can feel the presence of that love, of God's love, then you're well on your way. And maybe that's that hope that we were talking about earlier. There's still hope if you can acknowledge and accept the fact that God still loves you, even if you can't love yourself. I know that sounds kind of cliche and kind of bubblegum, but it's really, really true. A cliche is a cliche because it's true. It's a cliche because everybody says it. Everybody says it because it's true. Okay. And that's one of those. God loves you, period. Can that be enough? Can you accept that in a real way? Can you internalize that in a real way? Can that be enough to carry you through your healing so that you can get to a point where you can love yourself in the ways that He's instructed us to love others? All right. Let's get into our listener question for the day. Just as a reminder, if you have a question to submit for the show, send me an email at therapyandprayer@gmail.com. If you're watching this on YouTube, then you can put questions in the comments and you'll see it answered in an upcoming episode. So today's question says, I'm having trouble fully leaning into my relationship with God. Can you share some tips or what has worked for you? Yes. Yes, I can share some tips. Leaning into my relationship with God is an ongoing thing. One of the biggest lessons I'm learning in this season is how ongoing it is, and that there's no final frontier. I am always growing in my relationship with God, because I will never know everything that there is to know about Him. And I will always be finding new ways that I need Him. So that relationship it's ongoing, it's active. So I don't think that we ever really fully arrive there. Okay. But there are a few different things that have helped me and do help me to continue leaning into my relationship with God. And there are times where I have to like tap back into my relationship with God because maybe I've let some things get in the way, or I've let, distractions get in the way, or something has happened around me that has kind of like thrown me off. And so these are things to help me continue leaning into my relationship with God, or things that kind of help me tap back in. So the first is recognizing the fact that God has never stopped pursuing me. Oh my goodness. God has never stopped pursuing me. He wants to be close to me. Now, when we talk about relationships and we talk about wanting to be pursued and somebody needs to pursue me, nobody's going to pursue you like God pursues you. Okay. And that's the truth. Nobody is going to pursue you like God pursues you. He has never stopped pursuing me. And so when I really thought about the fact that like God wants to be close to me, like God, big G God, like the God wants to be close to me, just me, that was huge for me. But in general, even when we're talking about relationships and other folks, like I want people in my life who want to be there, and I want people in my life who want me in their life. And so if that is something that I look for in humans and other people, then it's absolutely something that God is already doing. And so leaning into that, and also at the same time, accepting the fact that there are no actions that I could do to earn his love because he already loves me. In another episode, I talked about like perfectionism and we talked a lot about shame and guilt and just really feeling like there are certain boxes that you have to check in order to earn God's love or in order to be worthy of it. And that's just not really a thing at all. And so that really freed me from some of the anxiety that I felt in really leaning into a more intimate and personal relationship with him. Along the same lines, approach getting to know God like you would approach getting to know another person. So think about it. Like when you're wanting to get to know them, when you're wanting to get to know a new person, how do you do that? You spend time with them. You talk to them. You ask them questions. You want to learn more about them. You stalk them on social media. Now, we can't really do that with God, but you can stalk him in the word. Okay? You can stalk him in the word. And the Bible shows us so much of God's character, all the nuanced ways that he considers us and his providence. And there's so much to know about God, and you can think you know him in one way, but he gonna show up and show out, and you're gonna be like, wait a minute. There's more to that. Like I thought I knew that, but there's more to that. And I just get so excited now to see like how is God going to reveal himself to me today? You think about going through your day as like, I'm going to hang out with God tomorrow. I started saying that. And I'm saying my prayers, before I go to bed. And sometimes I really say like, I can't wait to hang out with you tomorrow, God. Like I'm looking forward to hanging out with you. I'm looking forward to kicking it with you, God. Because I am, and I've talked about this before too, but really embracing a more casual relationship with God has been so helpful for me because I didn't feel like I had to like go specifically into my prayer closet to get into his presence and to be with him. I'm just with him all the time. Like we go together real bad. Like we're just always together, Something else really important. Don't compare your relationship with God to someone else's relationship with God. And don't compare your relationship with God to your relationship with anyone else. That makes sense? Y'all catch that? So everyone has their own relationship with God. And sometimes we can compare our relationship with God to what we think someone else's relationship with God is. Whether that be like people at church or folks in our family and like, oh, well, they study their Bible this many times a week and I only study my Bible this many times a week. So I must not be as close to God as they are. So that kind of comparison is really dangerous. And the other thing is that you can't compare your relationship with God to your relationship really with anybody else. I know I was just saying like approach getting to know God like you might approach getting to know people. But our relationship with God is so complex. He's such a complex being that he doesn't fit into one box like other people do. So comparing your relationship with God to your relationship with somebody else it's going to limit God. You might be able to compare some elements of it, but there is no comparison. It's so like far beyond really the kind of comprehension. And I think that that's really helpful and really liberating as well, because I don't know that there are really like rules to having a relationship with God. But if you're comparing it to a relationship with somebody else, then we're going to interact with God like we might interact with that person instead of interacting with God in whatever way that he deems fit. And to that point, I think another thing to consider is kind of like sometimes letting God take the lead. Asking God, like, what is it that you want to show me today? What is it that you want to tell me today? Where are we going? What are we doing? Acknowledging that he's already in control and like happily go and sit in the passenger seat, right? And like we're along for the ride. When you're going and running your errands, like, what do you want to show me while I'm going to the store today, God? Like talking to him while you're running your errands, while you're doing things. That's what they mean when they say like pray without ceasing. That's a part of it. It's that you can always talk to God anytime and anywhere. And lastly, be patient. Be patient with yourself because relationships take time. And when you make it a point to try to get closer to God, the enemy is going to try to make it a point to draw you further apart. So be patient. And be grateful that the desire is even on your heart to want to be close to him. My sister and I were just talking about this, how we used to pray for zeal. We used to pray for zeal and for a desire to want to be close to God. It's like, I want to be close to you. But the fact that that thought is even on your heart and on your mind is pleasing to God, because that says that there's a part of you that wants to know him better and that wants to be close to him. I firmly believe that anybody who seeks God honestly and earnestly and truly is going to find him. If you want to find that closer relationship with God, then you will find it. Ask God to help you to be closer to him, to help you feel closer to him. Ask him to reveal himself to you or to encounter you in whatever spaces he deems fit. Ask him to encounter you in spaces that you wouldn't expect to see him. Go into new spaces expecting to see him, expecting to find him. But relationships are dynamic. Our relationship with God is incredibly dynamic. But be patient with yourself. Be patient with this relationship as it develops, but also think about where you started, because you maybe didn't always have this same kind of zeal or this same kind of desire. So that in itself is a blessing. And I think that you are already well on your way. Okay. That's all I have for you all today. I hope that this was a blessing to someone. I I know that there's a lot more that can be said about depression and self-worth, but I hope and pray that this was at least a starting point, a jumping off point for you, and that this will help you to facilitate further healing. All right, y'all. Thank you so much for being here. I hope that you will come back again. I love you, and I will talk to you soon. Thanks for listening to this episode of Therapy and Prayer. Make sure you're subscribed and following wherever you listen to podcasts. And if the spirit moves you, go ahead and leave us a review. If you want to submit a question to be answered on this show, send us an email at therapyandprayer@gmail.com. And make sure you're following us on TikTok at Therapy and Prayer. Thanks again for listening. I'll talk to you soon.